So I'm absolutely delighted to be meeting David Satter in person here in Oxford. We won't say exactly where for security reasons, but it's a real pleasure to be doing this face-to-face rather than via Zoom. I won't go through the full biography. You can find a list of David's excellent publications, fantastic books that give a unique insight into the Russian mindset and history and help explain why we're at where we're at. Today we're going to be covering a whole range of topics, especially the Ukrainian war or the war against Ukraine. We're also going to look back at some of the reasons why Russia attacks and the foundations of Putin's regime. I won't say that made this inevitable, but certainly helps explain the aggression we see from Russia. Before we jump in, thank you to everybody who supports the channel, everybody who has bought me a coffee or become a patron. It's massively important to help continue the work of this channel, and I know many other creators rely on your generous support too, so thank you very much. David, it's an absolute delight to be here in the flesh.
Absolutely.
And as usual, we're talking about some deeply disturbing topics. Well, let's start with the present day before we sort of dive into deep history. The big conversation at the moment is negotiations. And there seems to be, on the one hand, someone like General Kellogg is getting interesting information, direct firsthand from Ukraine. It is said that his daughter has strong connections with Kiev and veterans charities, so that's kind of interesting. On the other hand, the statements, to my mind, seem to reveal a kind of naivety towards Russia and Putin, a belief that negotiations can be had in good faith and that Putin would adhere to whatever agreement transpired from that process. Do you think that's a sensible course of action, or is this naivety extremely dangerous?
It is very dangerous, and I think that we're in a situation now in which even those who understand the necessity of supporting Ukraine are very unrealistic about what it's going to require. I don't think that any deal that the West can propose, short of enforcing the capitulation of Ukraine, will satisfy Putin. And the fact that we're not ready for that reality is a terrible weakness. What needs to be done is to enlighten people in the U.S. about the true nature of the Putin regime, in the hope that they will have the wherewithal to put pressure on the administration, because, as we well know, Trump at this point controls all the instruments of power.
And there's a tendency to say that Trump is a transactional leader, and hence we've had these conversations about rare earth metals and trying to attract Trump to a Ukrainian victory, not based on values, but based on the potential profit that could be had from that. Is there also a tendency for them to perhaps see Putin as equally transactional and to see his violence as having some, I won't say values-based, but some economic rationality, when in fact the violence comes from a very different sort of place?
Yeah, it comes from a very different source indeed. It comes not from any concern over the welfare of the country, but rather a concern for his personal welfare and the welfare of those who he has helped to make rich, the members of his entourage. It's very easy to fall into the trap of assuming that Putin has certain reasonable objectives, that he can be satisfied if those objectives are met, and there'll be no further trouble. But this is not the case. It's a reflection of projecting American habits and tendencies onto a country which is very different, and leaders who display a depth of cynicism that is breathtaking from the point of view of any normal person in the West.
Not a huge surprise to yourself. You've been studying the origins not just of Putin's regime, but the historical origins of Russian violence and expansionism. So from your perspective, is this behavior we see from Putin, does that fit in a historical pattern? Is it comprehensible once you start unpacking the sort of Russian mindset and Russian history?
Yeah, I mean, sadly it is. Putin, of course, has adopted a pattern of behavior which has been typical for Russia, but he has done so in a manner that is, more ruthless and more indifferent to the lives of Russians than some previous Russian leaders, particularly Gorbachev.
And Yeltsin even, although Yeltsin did
Yeltsin was perfectly ready to organize massacres. And in fact, this is the problem with Yeltsin is that not only was he behind the shelling of the parliament in 1993, in which the nation's parliament and its elected deputies were shelled from tanks, but he also was in some way involved in the 1999 apartment bombings, either by directly approving them or of approving the people who any reasonable person would have known were prepared to go to any length to avoid defeat, to keep him safe and themselves in power.
And of course, we, the collective West, we played a role in maintaining Yeltsin's authority, didn't we? We helped him to hack the electoral process to keep him in power because we perceived that was a better thing than the communists coming back, the resurgent sort of communists. In a way, was our meddling in that? Did we help to set this pattern for authoritarianism? Because Yeltsin gave way to Putin almost seamlessly.
Yeah, well, very much so. The West, because of its superficiality and naivete, backed Yeltsin unconditionally under conditions in which we had the option of trying to restrain him. And we certainly could have reacted when the buildings were blown up, because the evidence was very clear, and there was a lot of it in their possession, that this was carried out by the FSB. But in every case, we idealized the Russian leaders, didn't see them for what they were, and gave them our full, in some cases unconditional support. And as a result, we lost any real control over the evolution of the situation.
And in some ways, as it works, if we go back to Bush and the Chick in Kiev speech, not only do we give this unconditional support, I would perhaps maintain, to try and keep the stability of Russia together, did we not also try to persuade Russia's ex-dominions to not drift far away from Russia? For instance, we tried to persuade Kiev before independence not to leave the Soviet bloc. Because that didn't work, it collapsed. We helped to denude Ukraine of its ability to defend itself against Russia, again on this idea that somehow, Russia should have its sphere of influence, and we should try to maintain that for the point of, I'm not sure what, sort of perceived stability.
Well, we were concerned to centralize the nuclear weapons which existed in several countries in one country where we thought they'd be under better control. And we underestimated the potential of a Russia-Ukraine conflict in the future. But to have understood the deep roots of that conflict and the reasons why Russia could not be trusted to honor any pledge to defend Ukraine's sovereignty, one would have to know a great deal about the history of the region, and there were not that many people in that category.
And I mean, it's interesting what you say about Yeltsin. You, of course, were in the country during Yeltsin's tenure. Is that correct?
Of course.
Yeah.
I was there frequently.
I was a humble student at the time, but I kind of, what's happened, the way Putin has used the Russian populace as material, or as Zelensky called it, sort of fire logs to throw on the furnace, is not a huge surprise, because under Yeltsin, I remember, one particular incident in St. Petersburg. If people have been there, there's a tube station that crosses over called Sadova, Senat Plощad. And at one point, they did one of these what's called a verbovka, where the press gang officers actually closed off the exits of the metro, and people were coming down the escalator and coming off the trains, and they weren't allowed out of the station until they proved, if they appeared that they were males of fighting age, that they'd actually done their service, and they had to show their documentation. Right. If they couldn't, they were whisked straight away to frontline bases, or to bases which would have been maybe a week away from Chechnya, the first Chechen war that was taking place at that point. So this I would categorize it as extreme inhumanity, was clearly evident then. What's interesting perhaps is Putin has not done that in the large population centers. In some ways,
in this war,
I mean, in some ways it's more hands-off than Yeltsin was, but that inhumanity comes as absolutely no surprise, having seen an incident like that.
Yes, I mean, he's got a resource which he can expend as he likes, and that's the lives of the Russian people. And he expends it strategically so as to minimize the possibility of unrest directed and demonstrations directed at him.
I want to talk a little bit about the information war and coercive manipulation, which I think is a really powerful tool in the Russian arsenal. But let's turn to the origins of Putin's regime first of all. You constantly come back to this theme of the apartment bombings, because I think you see it as not so much an origin story, but a foundational moment in Putin's regime, and essential to understand that in order to understand what follows and the wars that follow. To those who are not familiar, what was the apartment bombings? What do we know for certain now? And why, if Putin was behind it, did he carry that out?
Well, the apartment bombings are the most important event of the post-Soviet period, because they consolidated, they guaranteed Putin's elevation to the presidency. They consolidated the criminal state that had been founded by Yeltsin, and in effect confirmed it in the person of Putin. The bombings terrorized the country and basically created a completely different psychological atmosphere. And in this new psychological atmosphere, it was possible for Putin, who was described in St. Petersburg as a kind of gray mouse, to come forward and depict himself as the avenger of the Russian people, who had been perfidiously attacked by an enemy that did not care, whether it was destroying the lives of women and children or old people. And it worked. I mean, people were reorganized on behalf of a crusade against Chechnya, which began shortwith, and it was never really investigated, and those who tried to investigate were killed.
And so that message to the populace is one thing, creating this scenario of terror, which makes people more easily manipulated, is one thing. Using it to take over the news media is another, and of course we know Putin did that in the early years of his reign. Do we have any evidence that a slightly different message is sent towards the so-called elites, apparatchiks, and oligarchs especially, because they wouldn't necessarily be terrorized by the idea of Chechens? They have their own security details, private armies. Do we have any evidence that Putin sort of gave with a nod and a wink any of the elite to understand that actually he might have been behind this? Because that surely would be a far more effective coercive tool if he's able to show to the elite, look what I'm prepared to do.
No, he can't do that. But I mean, there are many examples of Putin's involvement in this. There's a great deal of proof, and it ranges from small incidents to quite major ones. And the fact is that we don't have subpoena power. We're dealing with a country in which there is no rule of law. No Russian court is going to convict Putin. And so therefore it's a little bit, we have to write in a somewhat qualified manner to say that the evidence shows, but the evidence does show that what happened when Putin rose to power was that those who were always the personal enemies of democracy, of progress of the rule of law, would take over and create a terroristic regime, which is what we have now.
And so do you see, obviously using the word inevitability is neither good journalism nor is it good history, but there is a pattern of escalation, of Putin seeking to achieve something through Georgia in 2008. Transnistria, of course, happened earlier. But this increasing sort of escalation or boldness in terms of what he's prepared to do. And of course, in Ukraine, it took him almost 10 years to go from a sort of proxy insurgency to full-scale war. Do you see a sort of escalating pattern? And what would happen?
You mean during all these years?
During all these. And what if we project that into the future?
I think it was really a question of what Putin needed in order to survive. The bombings were essential for Putin to become president. And the attacks on Ukraine began as a result of the Maidan revolt. There was no particular anti-Ukrainian campaign in Russia before 2013. But once it became clear that the Ukrainians were capable of organizing spontaneously against a kleptocratic ruler and even overthrowing that ruler, it became the highest priority for the Russians to discredit Ukraine and to mobilize their people against Ukraine, lest they mobilize against them and for it. And that's pretty much what happened.
And are they fearing that Russians themselves might follow that pattern, or are they fearing that ex-dominions would follow that pattern? Georgia and other countries would slip out of the sphere of influence.
I think they were concerned about the adverse example from their point of view that would be presented by Ukrainians' successful enjoyment of democracy.
And the control, not just the wealth, but the control that gives over their lives and security.
Of course, of course.
So we'll look at Putin. I mean, how do you explain Putin? He's got these influences. You've got the FSB background. You've got his stated view that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the most tragic event of the 21st century.
Well, he said that, of course, but as we well know, he himself, when it was a matter of the 1991 August coup attempt by pro-communist hardliners who wanted to hold together the Soviet Union, he was on the other side.
So that's just a convenient story that he
well, of course,
tells,
and I mean especially now. But when it wasn't convenient, he told another story.
And in this 90s period, you had the FSB or the KGB, which had lost a lot of power and influence through the sort of late 80s and early 90s. But through that period of the 90s, I get the impression they were building back up their networks. They were forming alliances with mafia groups, almost certainly with the aim of absorbing them and then coming to sort of dominate and control those to reassert the kind of statism, which I think the FSB stands for. And of course, they shared power with the Communist Party previously. Do you think it consciously became their view through the 90s that they could reassert the state, the power of the state, but with them at the top of the tree, with no other checks and balances or other kind of, I wouldn't call it sort of institutions, but nothing else to challenge them?
Well, the fact is that under the existing situation, they don't have much to challenge them. The only thing that would be really meaningful is a mass demonstration along the lines of the Maidan revolt. In Ukraine at that time, and I was there were demonstrations of 200,000 people in the center of Kyiv. Something like that, which becomes too big to suppress, that was the fear in the back of the minds of Kremlin policymakers. And it was for that reason that they began the whole series of actions that were determined to turn Ukraine into an uneasy but more or less friendly neighbor, and into an ogre that could be used to frighten Soviet citizens and persuade them that it's worth signing up for what is, in all probability, a death warrant.
And of course that failed. They didn't impose another Yanukovych-style character or Medvedchuk or someone. They lost control of Ukraine.
Well, they did, and that's the reason why they embarked on a war of conquest in Ukraine.
And in Georgia they did succeed, however, and for a period of time the party there, Bindiz Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream, they didn't have to be overtly they didn't have to show their true clothes. They were able to conduct a kind of hybrid operation until the point it looked like they might start to actually lose control, and they've become far more overtly pro-Kremlin. What's your sort of take on that? Were they always a puppet party, and did they only sort of turn to repressive measures when influence control looked like it was being ceded to the more Western-oriented civic society, etc.?
I think that basically Russia was ready to try, under the circumstances, a semi-Western type of system. But when they saw that really, even the limited freedoms that were tolerated in that framework, when they saw that even these could destabilize the regime or could be used to do so, that's when they decided that something had to be done to change the media environment in the US and in Western Europe and in Russia. And they did this with the help of publications that freely sacrificed in those areas.
So this is interesting, this point about control of the media internally, but
Right.
also manipulation of external media to Russia's ends. This is a feature of what's been called reflexive control in Russia. It's the ability to use psychology combined with informational warfare to get your opponent to ultimately do what you want them to do, but without necessarily realizing that. What's your understanding of it?
And becoming convinced it's his own idea. Yeah. That's what the art form is, to induce someone to repeat your propaganda under the impression that it's the result of his own thinking.
And you've tracked this capability through the Cold War into modern times. What are the origins of this technique, and how has it been adapted to Russia's, I would say, sort of nationalist revanchist phase compared to the communist period?
Well, during the communist period, the Soviet Union was based on an entire artificial and fictitious version of reality, which it tried to impose by force on its own population. It could not, of course, do so with the same effect to people who lived outside its borders, but it could use every method that was available to it to induce them to compromise with the artificial reality, with the fictitious world of the Soviet propaganda. And they did this, generally speaking, by creating the impression that they had something in common with the left opposition in the target country, and in fact were potentially allies of that left opposition, shared values with that left opposition, and were just as distressed about the right wing in the target country as the left-wingers themselves. There were constant examples of this. In fact, we had lots of Henry Kissinger, in fact, in his discussions with Anatoly Dobrinin, who was the Soviet ambassador to the United States, complained about Congress and the right wing and those, as if he and Dobrinin were in some respects partners in the pursuit of peace rather than adversaries. So that basic methodology carried over after the fall of the Soviet Union because it's quite effective. It's rooted in the fact that Americans know very little about Russia. They don't understand really the mentality of a country where society is organized and construes itself in the image of a mass movement. They come from pragmatic societies in which people defend individual interests. And as a result, they have a certain amount of success. Whenever a society becomes particularly vulnerable to Russian disinformation when it is divided upon itself, as the situation which we have in the United States, we have it in other Western societies. Because under those conditions, the narratives which are put together by the Russians, which are absolutely self-serving and basically dishonest, are gain a certain plausibility because the Russians are identified as being quote-unquote friends. Mm-hmm. It was an interesting situation during the Cold War. The Russians had 10,000 tanks poised to pour over the border of West Germany. And they were confronted with NATO forces armed with anti-tank weapons, which of course the Soviet propaganda depicted it as a threat to the Soviet Union, even though these are defensive weapons. Now, no psychologically normal person would look at this configuration of forces and assume that the West was threatening Russia with its anti-tank weapons. A normal person would say that the Soviet tanks were threatening the West, and the anti-tank weapons were a legitimate defensive measure. But the whole point of Soviet disinformation was to get people not to see the obvious. And they could do that to a great extent by, for example, identifying with the national liberation movement in the Third World, calling for various social welfare schemes, depicting themselves as social democrats in a hurry, boasting about the Russian welfare state. The fact that Soviet Union, I'm using Russia and the Soviet Union interchangeably here, but the Soviet Union was a country in which there was full employment. Of course, if you didn't want to participate in that full employment, you would end up in a labor camp, but that's another thing. And under the influence of that false impression of the Soviet Union, the idea that the Soviets are somehow progressive, an impression that was fostered through all kinds of Soviet front groups, and with the help of a lot of what are justifiably called useful idiots. It was an uphill struggle at times for rational and patriotic Americans and citizens of other Western countries to convince the population of the necessity to take strict defensive measures. This was particularly obvious when it came to the question of stationing mid-range missiles in Western Europe in response to a deployment of SS-20, also mid-range missiles, by the Soviets targeted on Western Europe. In order to neutralize that threat, we had to deploy our own missiles. But the deafening propaganda campaign that was carried out by the Soviet Union and found a very strong response in leftist movements in NATO countries in the West, almost derailed it. I mean, the deployment went ahead in the end. Thank God there was enough common sense. Well, we have something, similar now with the Russians. They have targeted to a great extent the American conservatives. Some American conservatives, I mean, not all of them are receptive. Obviously, the invasion of Ukraine, an unprovoked invasion of a sovereign country with which Russia had a friendship treaty and many other treaties which implicitly and explicitly recognized Ukraine's territorial boundaries, it would be should be obvious to all Americans. But the internal divide in the United States is such that anyone identified in any way with the Democrats and the party of wokeism is considered an enemy, and under those conditions, this group of anti-Ukrainian conservatives are extremely vulnerable to being fed a surface plausible explanation of the conflict, but of course deeply dishonest and erroneous. A person in his right mind wouldn't accept it for a minute, but under the influence of these other factors, it can seem persuasive. Now, the kind of people who have bought into this, are not very perceptive. We could even recall what Nikita Khrushchev said about Sam Yorty, the mayor of Los Angeles. He said of Sam, the light of intelligence does not shine from his eyes. And I think this is something we can say about many of the people who buy into the Russian propaganda over Ukraine. But they're conditioned not by the convincing nature of the Russian propaganda, but rather by their animosity toward the other side in the U.S. And this is something that the Russians use all the time. The other factor that's very important is that we don't know how to answer Russian propaganda. Our typical response is they say they put out some lie or the other. I don't know, that U.S. is spreading AIDS in the third world, or there's there are biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine, or I mean any number.
COVID vaccines is another verifiable area where, whatever the scientific evidence, certainly Russia piled in to create a sense of distrust and disorientation.
Yeah, of course, wherever they can. Mm-hmm. And but the point is that our American or British, our Western response tends to be, to answer it, to say, well, this is false, it's not right, and in the process we circulate it. And what we can't get into our heads oftentimes is that countering Russian propaganda actually means understanding Russia and having information about Russia. Let me just take the apartment bombings, which is so difficult for the Western mind to accept, because it's so counterintuitive. It's a level of evil we're not accustomed to dealing with. If Putin says Zelensky is an illegitimate leader, and we say, well, in fact, he is legitimate. The only reason elections aren't being undertaken now is because people can't vote in the face of possible bombardment. True enough, of course, but it repeats the original absurd accusation, and is not the way to deal with the whole question of legitimacy. If Putin says that Zelensky, an elected leader, is illegitimate, we say that what we should say is that Putin has never been legitimate. Putin came to power through an act of terror against his own people, but for that we have to know a lot, and we don't want to go to that trouble.
I mean, one of the reasons why the Soviet Union did not succeed in this particular technique is, as you say, it told a story that really could only be used to reach out to the extreme or hard left. It did not have an equivalent story for the right. Is that a major distinguishing feature of the Russian regime now? It can manufacture stories for left and right and whatever point of view it can latch onto to create those divisions.
I think the Soviet Union was able to do the same. Of course, the thrust of it was but the Soviet Union also expended considerable efforts to convince quote-unquote realists and geopoliticians that it was only interested in its legitimate geopolitical interests. With the constellation that existed at that time, it was that argument worked better with people on the right than with people on the left who were more concerned about, solidarity with world socialism or whatever they thought they were.
And that realist thought
but
has
when
really
we
cut
when,
through to the present, hasn't
yeah,
it?
well, but when we get to the Russia of today, this depiction of Russia as a traditional power just operating according to real politik, that is intended to appeal to the more liberal. If this kind of geopolitical version in the Soviet times was directed more toward the right, now it tends to be directed more toward the left. People, the American right wing doesn't go to the Valdai, or didn't go to the Valdai discussion club. These were people who were academics. In some cases, they became American policy advisors, and their minds were pickled in the Valdai quote-unquote discussion club, but more accurately described as the Valdai disinformation and propaganda club. Whereas on the contrary, the values approach was on the part of present-day Russia. If in the Soviet Union it was aimed at those people who were proponents of socialism in one form or another, now it's aimed at the values argument at those who are considering themselves the defenders of conservative values, the enemies of gay marriage, of transgenderism, of God knows what, Because in Russia, they point out there is no gay marriage. The transgenderism is not encouraged, and gay propaganda, as they put it, that's how they describe it, is not allowed in the schools. So there are people, of course, on the right in the U.S. who take that to mean that Russia's a conservative country and a country that is defending conservative values.
And the Orthodox Church, of course, they really make a big play of this. Never mind the statistics that Russia has the highest abortion rates in Europe, the highest divorce rates in Europe. You have extraordinary abuse within relationships, which is partially legal as well. So it's extraordinary hypocrisy, actually.
Well, it's extraordinary superficiality and ignorance. Let's put it that way. But softened up in this respect, and it's been catastrophic, really, for Ukraine. the false Russian narrative, gains traction. Not because it's convincing in and of itself, but because people then identify with the source. And then they have another technique to which we should call attention, I think, which is when there's an atrocity, for example, like the shooting down of the Malaysian airliner, they set up a deafening propaganda barrage about the airliner being shot down by Ukrainian jets. And this is, of course, wholly unbelievable. But they don't intend for people to believe it. They then release a false audio recording indicating that separatists shot it down. And although people will reject the notion that MH17 was shot down by Ukrainian jets, they will accept the equally false version that it was shot down by separatists, and ignore completely the real truth, which is it was shot down by the Russians. So they have if we are talking about overall strategy and planning, they try to influence people's minds in the long term by giving them a false impression of themselves. But there are specific events that come up. For example, the shooting down of the airliner, or the murder of Boris Nemtsov, various other things, in which their technique is very, very clear. They begin with an absurd explanation, against the background of which their false explanation, but slightly more plausible, can be accepted, and the real truth will be simply ignored.
We have an example of that right now. So if one assumes that Tucker Carlson is batting for the Russian side, and he's explicitly said that he doesn't care, if Russia wins, he's come out and said that at least 50% of weapons provided to Ukraine end up in the hands of Mexican drug cartels. The reality, from what I can tell, is that it's 0%. But this may be an example of the technique you've talked about here. He comes out and says something which is patently false and hugely exaggerated. People might say, well, of course, that's ridiculous, but maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10%. The reality is 0%, but he's planted this idea in people's minds.
Well, I think in the case of people like Carlson, this is the technique that the Russian intelligence services refer to as ventriloquism. Someone has planted that, and he repeats it because he trusts these. They've cultivated him, and he, for the reasons that we discussed, because he has been sufficiently convinced that they are anti-woke, and he treats it uncritically and repeats it. I think it's just, and he's one of the people through whom they can plant all kinds of things.
Another great example, but this is completely flipping it. It's a form of ventriloquism, but it's using someone who is perhaps unaware that it's being used. This is Christopher Steele and the so-called dodgy dossier, or the weaponized dossier, which he lobbed like a grenade into the US political process. That very much helped to weaponize the media, especially the centrist and left-leaning media, against Trump in the first term, and it also helped to entrench Trump's base behind him, and it really weaponized the media environment. But your contention is that the Steele dossier is a piece of obvious tradecraft designed to weaponize the media space.
Well, the Steele dossier, when it came out, I mean, I first saw it when it was published by BuzzFeed in January 2017, and I was in a kind of peculiar position. Many of the people who were reading that dossier were reading Russian disinformation for the first time, whereas I, of course, had had decades of exposure to it. And I recognized that they hadn't even bothered to change some of their typical phraseology and their typical approach. And a lot of what they said had even been lifted from the Valdai discussion or propaganda club, whatever we want to call it. So I understood immediately it was a fake, and I understood it was put out there by the Russians in order to disrupt American politics. And I wrote about this. I wrote about it in National Review and then in Wall Street Journal. What was interesting was not the fact that the Democrats did not want to talk to me about it and ignored it altogether, what I was writing, even though I was writing in prominent places. What was interesting was the fact that Republicans ignored it as well, because they could not get their minds around the idea that Russians that Russian disinformation chooses somebody you blacken someone's reputation by accusing them of being an ally of Russia. It was they couldn't quite come to grips with that until, of course, it was finally shown that Trump had not colluded with the Russians. Even this talk about the incident in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel with the prostitutes urinating on the bed of Obama and so on. This was all bears the mark of KGB FSB novelists who are they've been inventing false stories for forever in order to justify purges, murders, God knows what. So making things up to them becomes second nature, and the more fantastic and the more idiotic, the better.
I'm sure they get a real thrill out of this sense of manipulation. I mean, that's the essence of psychopathy, isn't it?
Well, they enjoy the manipulation, but the important thing is that there were people in the Democratic Party, there were people in the Clinton campaign. Now, this, of course, really gained momentum after Clinton was defeated, which suggests there was an element of revenge here for the defeat. In any case, there had been some efforts before the election, when Clinton thought she would win, to suggest that Trump was a candidate of the Russians, in response to the fact that a lot of emails from the Democratic National Committee were linked by hackers who were tied to the Russians. What their motives were, even today, is not clear. But it swung into full gear after her defeat, when he became president, and the dossier was circulated to any reporter in Washington who asked for it or who took an interest, and with the knowledge, I think that very, very few people would be able to understand what they were seeing. And of course, typical was a headline of CNN: Steele dossier partially confirmed. I mean, you cannot imagine the idiotism, because all Russian information includes some truthful information in order to get you to believe the untruthful. And the absurdity, the situation reached a height of absurdity because Trump was being accused of colluding with the Russians in a dossier which was the product of collusion between the Clinton campaign and the FSB. The Clinton campaign paid lawyers to pay Steele, to pay his quote-unquote sources. His sources were FSB. Thing is, Steele is part of that. I mean, now whether he did this just out of stupidity, which I don't exclude, or maybe he's, who knows where his loyalties really lie.
Or whether they're monetary loyalties.
If he was being paid off. But these firms, these business intelligence firms, were staffed by former Western intelligence agents who make use of their quote-unquote Russian contacts, are basically perfect for disinformation distribution, because the Russians don't need them for anything. They don't need to share their information with Westerners. What if they parcel out some things that have some business consequences? It's only as a down payment for eventually using them for much more important propaganda purposes, as they did in this case.
It's a campaign.
The Russians, seeing that the Democrats and the Hillary campaign were salivating to find something, to discredit Trump, were happy to produce it and even to get paid for it. Because for 3 years they said they created turmoil in American society. And of course, it was the lack of professionalism of American so-called Russia experts and of American journalists that made it possible. Who constantly, and former intelligence officials, who were constantly citing unnamed sources, who in fact, as confirming information about which they had no knowledge.
And perhaps this worked much better than their wildest dreams and plans.
I think it worked as well as they figured it would work, because it was the malevolence and the thirst for revenge of the Democrats and of the Clinton campaign that they were going to ruin the Trump presidency, and they certainly did have an effect on it. And that's one of the reasons why we're getting these kind of reactions now that Trump is back in office. And this is one of the reasons why we're as divided as we are. It's one of the reasons why the Russians are so capable of manipulating us. It's one of the reasons why Ukraine is in such danger.
And, because we're having to wrap up here, we're not out of the woods. In fact, we're deeper down this partisan rabbit hole. If you're in Russian intelligence, you must be looking at this as a kind of bonanza, an opportunity to manipulate the left against the right against left, everybody against each other.
They're studying it for sure. They're
I'm surely they're doing more than studying. Surely they're going to inject more of this tradecraft into this environment.
This is the problem, you see, because we now have a wartime situation, and under these conditions, the game is a little bit different. What is it they want to do? They wanted to do different things at different times. Right now, they want to hobble American support for Ukraine and
so that's the number one.
And Western support and British support. How to do that? Well, it may not necessarily be, creating conflict between Trump and his political enemies. It may well be getting those who have influence over Trump to accept their version of events, and that's where I think the focus is at the moment. Doesn't mean that it can't change as circumstances change. It usually does.
So that's what we should look out for, is narratives that seek to divide allies and stop the aid flowing to Ukraine.
Well, clearly, narratives that depict Russia as what it is not, that depict the aggression as a response to NATO, to NATO advancement. All of these things are easily refutable, but they're refutable by people who have clear minds and a desire to be objective.
And the idea that Russia's invincible. That's another classic.
Well, that's another thing. They want to play. They play on people at a subconscious level by a step. They don't argue the facts, and because there's nothing to argue. But they do try to establish a kind of an affinity, a false affinity, which is possible because the target audience is woefully uninformed and lazy and not willing to make the effort.
And that is partially why this channel exists, is to try to provide some of that background, some of the information. Once again, massively grateful to you for appearing on the channel.
Oh, I'm always glad to be here, Jonathan. It's delightful to be with you in Oxford.
And if people are intrigued by this, if they want to fill in that context to better help understand how they can support Ukraine and the truth behind Russia's war, I recommend they go back and watch our previous conversations, your conversations on other channels such as Times Radio, but especially read your books, which I think provide a unique insight into the Russian mindset and why this projection of violence has deep historical roots and deeply traumatic roots. But for today, David, thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.